Hear him, ye deaf, ye voiceless ones, your loosened tongues employ. Ye blind, behold, your Savior comes, and leap, ye lame, for joy. You may be seated. When I was 10 years old, my sister got a big old bag of candy from a woman at church for doing nothing more than turning 8. And in that I was 10, and in that I had no candy of my own, I thought it right that I should have some of hers. In my mind, my solution to my problem seemed rather obvious. She had some candy. I wanted some candy. She should give me some candy. Problem solved. The only thing is, my sister Shannon did not see the brilliance of that remedy as clearly as I did. In fact, she thought very little of my solution to the problem of me having no candy. In fact, I don't think that Shannon saw it much of a problem for her at all. And so I changed my tack. I told her, any old person could turn 8 years old. In fact, I'd accomplished the exact same thing only 2 years earlier, so she really hadn't done anything to get all that, and so she should give me some of it. She remained unmoved, and so I could see the writing on the wall. I wasn't going to get any of her candy. Well, I guess at that point I just turned to desperate measures, and I resorted to out-and-out begging. And with that, she decided to give me something. And the something that she gave me was 6 black jelly beans. Now, as you well know, for kids, black jelly beans are no good. Black jelly beans are kind of for losers. No kid wants black jelly beans, although this morning I did hear about one person. I mean, if Shannon had eaten every bit of candy in that entire bag, the only thing that she would have voluntarily left would have been those 6 black jelly beans. She hates black jelly beans to this day. And so she wasn't giving me any sort of gift. She was kind of getting rid of her waste, which seemed to me to be a great injustice. I was older, bigger, a good bit meaner, and I wanted at least a red, yellow, or even green jelly bean offered in deference to those attributes. Shannon, however, remained unmoved. She looked me right in the eye from her exalted position of candy power, and she said, "Beggars can't be choosers." That's what she said. Beggars can't be choosers. Beggars don't have the luxury of choice because, after all, we're beggars. I was the beggar. She was the chooser. And so I ate nasty black jelly beans because of it. Beggars can't be choosers. This is an idiom that was obviously lost on Naaman, the Syrian commander general that we meet in this morning's Old Testament lesson. If beggars can't be choosers, well, Naaman certainly had no idea. Or at least Naaman had no idea that he, in actuality, was a beggar. That kind of makes sense for someone like him. He was Naaman after all. This was at the height of the Assyrian Empire. And so he's this big dog from a big dog place, and Naaman, the big dog Syrian, in his own mind could not possibly be a beggar. That just was impossible given who he was. And yet Naaman had a problem, and it was a really big problem. He had contracted leprosy. And because Naaman was now a leper, he undoubtedly was a beggar when it came to his own healing. And yet, his prestige, all that he had, all that he was, all of that made him choosy. He foolishly thought that he had the luxury of being a choosy beggar, which my 8-year-old sister Shannon knew was impossible. And yet somehow Naaman did not. Now, Naaman's story is one of these really wonderful contrasts. For instance, Naaman's, very mighty. Again, he's at the height of a very important huge empire. He has all of the world at his feet, in other words. And yet, the contrast is he's also in this situation helpless when it comes to his own health. And all of his greatness can't change any of that one bit. In fact, the story shows him being impotent enough that he has to get help from this little Jewish slave girl, who in turn refers him to some, what I'm sure in his mind was kind of some witch doctor sort of prophet from that weak little vassal country of Israel, a prophet named Elisha. And yet even then, Naaman and even the king of Syria, they cannot open up or own up to their own helplessness in this situation. Their helplessness in the face of leprosy. They continue to live in the story under this illusion that somehow their riches and their power will make some sort of difference in his healing. They'll go to Israel, and yet they still want their stature. If you heard the story well, they wanted their stature to seal the deal. And so the Syrian king, he loads Naaman up to the brim with treasure. He writes this long letter of commendation, telling the little powerless king in Israel to get Naaman healed, as though it's just that easy. Or that treasure and letters are going to do anything to accomplish that. But the little king in Israel knows it's not just that easy. He knows what money can't buy, like a cure for leprosy, and so he's utterly terrified. And well, he should be. I mean, after all, who in the world does this powerful neighbor expect him to be that he could heal Naaman? Who is he, after all, God? And yet Israel's king's lack of faith lies in contrast with Elijah the prophet's tremendous faith, who, when he hears about all this, says, no sweat, I'll heal him. Just send him to me. And so Naaman reluctantly goes. He surely had to wonder why he had to go in the first place, why they weren't coming to him. And yet he goes with a bad attitude, and he arrives at the prophet Elisha's to be healed. And upon arrival, he's expecting this grand welcome. He's expecting the healing to take place with a grand show, because after all, he's this really big deal. He expects fireworks and incantations and gaudy rituals, things we Episcopalians really like. But Elisha doesn't even bother to come out of his shack to meet Naaman face to face. He merely sends out instructions. Naaman, go wash yourself 7 times in the Jordan River, and you'll be made good as new. And with that, Naaman's ego's just finally had enough. You got to be kidding me, he says. Where are all the rituals? All I get is a bath, and I have to take it in that ditch that you call the Jordan River? No way. I didn't come all this way to wash myself in the Jordan River. We have better rivers back home in Syria. Why would I step foot in there? And with that, Naaman the beggar gets choosy and decides to pack it up and go home. And yet once again, his servants come to his rescue. If Elisha had asked you to do something really difficult, they say, like say climb Mount Everest or run a marathon or go to the North Pole, you would have done that to cure your leprosy. That's what you expected, something hard, something significant. And so why should you be disappointed that your task is so very small? Why not just give this simple, nothing of a task a try? And so Naaman finally does. Naaman washes himself in the Jordan 7 times. Without a doubt, he fussed the entire time, and yet he did it. And lo and behold, on the 7th time, Naaman came up cleansed, healed. His flesh restored, we're told, like that of a little child. And with that, I hope Naaman realized that beggars can't be choosers. That sure, when you beg, you might, at least on this side of heaven, end up with nothing but a bunch of black jelly beans from your mean sister. But when you beg to the other side of heaven, to God, you might just end up with a whole lot more. And what you'll inevitably end up with is a new state that no matter what, no longer allows you to just simply be a beggar. Now, at this point, you may be wondering, well, what does this strange, ancient story possibly have to do with any of us here today? And I think, first off, that it's important to realize that by global and historical and economic standards, most every one of us in this room are a lot more like Naaman than anyone else in this story. That is, we today live in the modern day equivalent of Assyria. That is, we live in the empire, the superpower, live certainly in the first world, but the first nation by many metrics in the first world. And therefore, most of us have the trappings of privilege and power and all the stuff that's advertised to make us happy and safe and whole. And yet, very much like Naaman, there comes a point in most of our lives when having stuff proves worthless. Wealth is useless in the face of many things. See, Naaman's power did not come from him developing, didn't keep him, rather, from developing that dreaded disease. And it sure wasn't going to cure him of it. The point being for us, just like for him, that even when you have all kinds of things, you can still end up in this world somehow in the position of being a beggar. You can be a rich beggar, and yet a beggar all the same, because sometimes life just shows up. And when it does, you can't buy your way out of it. And at those moments when choices aren't for sale, you find out for sure that beggars can't be choosers. Growing up in Memphis, I knew a man, a wonderful man, super respected, very wealthy. It's kind of a big deal in that area. It's a businessman who sadly one day found himself in a situation not unlike that of Naaman the Syrian. He was diagnosed at the very young age of 59 with Alzheimer's. And not long after that diagnosis, as you can imagine, he had to give up his career, which was a great amount of the source of his prestige and his positions within the community. And as you know, that disease does, he was cruelly reduced ultimately to helplessness. Now, of course, he had a lot of stuff. And yet all the king's horses and all the king's men could not put him back together again. Despite his wealth, he became a beggar of sorts. And just like Naaman, he had to come to this place where he had to leave behind and take off all the power and the prestige and the wealth and just kind of walk naked into his own Jordan River, which for him was the care of an often neglected but very loving family upon which he all of a sudden had to totally rely. He was a beggar, and his provision had to come from a source of goodness that he could not give himself. It's odd, it's ironic even that healing, whether of a disfiguring ailment of the flesh or some sort of disease like my friend Ron had, or just the brokenness that can set into the human heart and spirit, that those sorts of healings only begin when we acknowledge our own vulnerability before them and our own inability to be in charge of those circumstances. That's the only time that we finally are able, I guess, to find that grace that we need. And grace by its very nature is something that we could never give ourselves. It comes from outside of us to us. That's why it's called grace. And I'll admit that, that strange and off-center perspectives for we name and like people, because after all, most of what we're taught is kind of the exact opposite. That we can accomplish anything, that we don't need anyone, that you're not a beggar unless you choose to be. That's what we think is strength in this world. And yet one day get the wrong diagnosis, or have your child fall ill. Just have the bottom drop out of life, and you're going to learn pretty quickly just how much choice you really have, how far self-reliance really won't take you. See, sometimes better wisdom is knowing what you can't do for yourself, the limits of what power and money can yield. And I think sometimes strength is being strong enough to ask for that power that you must have that has to come from someplace outside of yourself, outside of me, beyond me, bigger than me, that somehow, nonetheless, in grace, is seeking me out, surprising me, properly humbling me, and yet all the while providing for me. Now, you should call that just common sense. Some would call it a coming to Jesus moment, maybe a coming to reality moment. I, though, choose to call it a God moment. And yet don't fail to call it in your life, for your life needs it. You need it even when you can't own up to the fact that you need it. You just got to remember the beggars can't be choosers, and you got to be wise enough to realize that when push comes to shove, each and every one of us in one way or another come as beggars into some portion of our lives. Our healing, our wholeness comes from outside of ourselves so very often. In weird places even, a ditch like the Jordan, from neglected families that love us despite ourselves, always from a God who gives beyond what we possibly could deserve. I've seen it come in this room, in the waters of that baptismal font, this table where we stretch out our empty hands to get what we could never give ourselves. It comes outside of these walls in a million ways that we don't even have eyes to see or the sense to realize, but it's coming. But it always comes in an act of self-surrender, always despite our worth, always in that old saying of kind of letting go somewhat and letting God more and more. And this makes sense because even if that's not how we would choose to do it, that's how God chooses to do it, because he knows what we need to be who we need to be, and that we don't have that in and of ourselves alone. In this world, beggars can't be choosers. And yet here's the thing, God will never leave any of us in that state. God always takes us and raises us in his grace to places that we could never achieve on our own, and yet through God's grace still allows us to inhabit and be. This morning, I hope you realize that God is handing out to your life a great deal more than black jelly beans. And thank God for that. Amen.